If you ever thought government secrets were just conspiracy theories, think again. Some things are hidden in plain sight, but others are so deeply buried that even those with the highest clearance don't know they exist. There are facilities, places you could pass by every day without suspecting a thing. But beneath their unmarked walls, behind layers of fortified security, there lies something that defies explanation, something they never intended for the world to know. Imagine a place so controlled, so restricted, that only a handful of people have ever set foot inside. This isn't just any high-security lab. It's a place designed for purposes you and I can barely comprehend, a place where reality starts to twist. Those few who've been there carry scars not on their bodies, but in their minds, in their very souls. They walk away with a look in their eyes, a kind of hollow stare, as if they've glimpsed something beyond the realm of human understanding, so far beyond nightmares, that it's altered them forever. What lies behind these doors is so volatile, so beyond our comprehension, that even its creators had to abandon it. And yet, it's still there, sealed in silence, waiting. These walls hide things that shouldn't have ever been conceived, creations and discoveries that stretch beyond the edge of science and into something else, something dark. Imagine looking into a place where every boundary you've ever known, every law of nature, becomes meaningless. But the most chilling thing, this facility wasn't designed for research. No, the things here were meant to be controlled, to be weaponized, to be exploited. Behind these walls are secrets that can shift the balance of power, ideas so dangerous that they've been wiped from official records, erased from every file, every document, as though they never existed. But they do. And they're kept under such heavy lock and key that even whispers of their existence are enough to make insiders go silent. What would drive someone to create these things? To defy nature in ways that go beyond all moral and ethical boundaries? Some say it started as a simple experiment, a search for ways to push humanity to its limits, to reach the pinnacle of what's possible. But along the way, they crossed a line. They opened doors that should have remained closed, tampered with forces they couldn't control. They didn't just want to understand the unknown, they wanted to harness it, to bring it to heel. And in doing so, they unleashed something far more dangerous than they could ever have anticipated. There are tales brief, fragmented accounts of workers who've gone in, young, eager scientists who signed up without knowing the true nature of their work. They were told they'd be part of groundbreaking research, that they were making history. But when they walked out, if they walked out, they were different. Their faces were marked by a kind of fear that words can't describe, as if they'd seen things that no one should ever see, and they never spoke of it again. What if this is more than just a story? What if right now, hidden beneath layers of concrete and steel, these secrets are still alive, still waiting for the right moment, for someone bold or foolish enough to find them? And if you ever did, if you came face to face with what's hidden here, would you survive? Could you leave it behind, or would it haunt you for the rest of your life? This isn't the story of something lost to time or forgotten by history. No, this is something ongoing, something living. The people who work there know it. They feel it every time they step through those doors, every time they pass those endless, sterile corridors. They know that what's kept behind those locked doors is something we were never meant to understand. So before you brush this off as just another story, ask yourself, how much do you trust what you think you know? How safe do you really feel in a world where secrets like these are hidden just beneath the surface, closer than you'd ever dare believe? The facility itself doesn't look like much from the outside. It's a nondescript building, gray and lifeless, almost designed to fade into the background. If you didn't know any better, you'd think it was just another government office, a place for filing endless stacks of paperwork, a place where bureaucrats shuffle in and out without a second glance. It's surrounded by fences high, barbed, with guards stationed every few feet. They stand there, silent, expressionless, their eyes fixed forward, as if programmed to ignore everything outside those gates. For anyone else, the sight of those guards, the motion-activated cameras that track every movement, and the absolute quiet surrounding the place might be enough to turn them away. But to those who work there, it's just another day. It's the kind of quiet that feels unnatural, like even the air knows it shouldn't linger here too long. The protagonist of our story, a young, eager recruit, came here full of questions, his mind buzzing with the possibilities of what he might learn. Fresh out of training, he'd been placed in a division known for its confidentiality, a department so cloaked in secrecy that even among government employees, Only whispers hinted at its existence. He'd been assigned to routine tasks, moving data from one secured terminal to another, monitoring systems with barely a flicker on the screen. It was the kind of work that made him question why so much secrecy was necessary at all. But then, little things began to catch his attention. It started with the restricted areas, zones marked off with heavy, reinforced doors and keypad locks requiring levels of clearance he hadn't even known existed. On his first day, a stern-faced supervisor had told him to avoid these areas. Don't ask questions, he'd been warned. Your clearance doesn't cover it. And yet, as days turned into weeks, his curiosity began to gnaw at him. He'd noticed the doors with thick locks and silent alarms, the faint hum of machinery hidden just out of sight. Sometimes late at night, when the corridors were deserted, he'd hear sounds coming from deep within the building, sounds that didn't match any machine he knew. A distant whirring, a low thump, the kind of noises that felt out of place in an office environment. And then there were the shadows, quick glimpses of figures moving down hallways they weren't supposed to be in, people who seemed to vanish as soon as they were noticed. The people who worked in those restricted areas were different too. They moved like ghosts, heads down, avoiding eye contact, their faces pale and drawn, as though whatever they were working on had drained every ounce of life from them. Some looked almost haunted, as if whatever secrets they kept weighed on them so heavily that they could barely lift their eyes from the floor. One night, working late on a seemingly endless report, he heard it again, the low thumping, a heavy, rhythmic sound echoing from somewhere below. It was faint but unmistakable. Against his better judgment, he decided to investigate. The hallways were dimly lit, shadows pooling in the corners, stretching across the floor. He felt a chill as he walked, a strange prickle at the back of his neck, as if something unseen was watching him, hidden in the darkness. As he made his way down the corridor, he caught a glimpse of something odd. A door that was always closed was now slightly ajar. It was one of the restricted access doors, one he had been specifically told never to enter, the kind with a keypad lock and a warning posted above it, authorized personnel only. The door was open just a crack, enough to reveal a faint, greenish glow seeping out from inside. His heart pounded as he hesitated. Everything in his training told him to turn back, to report it and leave. But curiosity got the better of him. He stepped closer, his hand trembling as he pushed the door open just a bit wider. What he saw inside stopped him cold. He hesitated at the door, his fingers hovering just over the cold metal handle. The glow spilling out into the hallway was an unnatural shade, almost sickly, casting strange shadows across the walls. With a final glance down the corridor to make sure no one else was around, he slipped inside, closing the door silently behind him. The air in the room felt different, stale, thick, with a faint chemical odor that made him want to hold his breath. The hallway stretched ahead of him, dimly lit by flickering lights overhead. As he walked, each step seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls in a hollow, unsettling way. His footsteps felt too loud, breaking the otherwise eerie silence, and he found himself trying to step more quietly, his senses on edge. He soon noticed the walls were marked with strange symbols, etched in a dark, faded red. Symbols he didn't recognize, strange shapes and characters that seemed almost ritualistic. Beneath each symbol, there were warning signs plastered across the walls, hastily printed and peeling at the edges. Danger, unauthorized access prohibited, biohazard, and another in bold red letters, simply reading, "Do not proceed without protective gear." Each sign felt like a warning, as if whatever lay ahead was something meant to stay hidden. A low hum filled the hallway, punctuated now and then by a crackling static noise that came and went without any pattern. At times it almost sounded like faint whispers, barely audible, as if someone or something was just around the corner, murmuring secrets meant for no one to hear. He glanced over his shoulder, certain he'd catch sight of a figure lurking just behind him, but there was nothing. Only the empty corridor stretching out, with shadows gathering in the corners. The deeper he moved, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. He passed several closed doors, each with a reinforced lock, and a small window covered in dust, barely allowing a glimpse inside. But behind each door, he could just make out vague shapes, strange shadows that didn't look like any equipment he was familiar with. There were glass chambers filled with a thick, greenish fluid, and something floating inside them just beyond his sight. He shuddered, resisting the urge to peer in closer. And then he saw a room at the end of the hallway with a plaque on the door that read Project Lazarus. He paused, his mind racing. This was something he had only heard rumors about, whispers among the few daring enough to speculate. Project Lazarus, the name alone carried a weight to it, a sense of dread and finality. He reached out, and with a trembling hand, opened the door. Inside, the room was cluttered with documents, scattered across tables and pinned to the walls, diagrams and charts and pages of scrawled notes. As he picked up one of the papers, he realized he was looking at reports, dense with scientific jargon he could barely understand. But one phrase kept repeating, etched into his mind as he scanned page after page, Subject 0. There were sketches, diagrams of something vaguely human but twisted, altered in ways that made him shiver. The notes spoke of experiments that defied nature, attempts to push the boundaries of human potential to create something more. Subject 0 was referenced again and again, but every description was vague, contradictory, as if even the researchers didn't fully understand what they had created. He could see words like unstable, unpredictable, and a final note scrawled hastily in the corner of one document. Containment is our only option. He flipped through more papers, each one more unsettling than the last. Diagrams of something restrained, caged, surrounded by complex machinery designed to monitor and control it. They spoke of life, but not as he knew it. Something artificially brought into existence, something that should not have been. The words Project Lazarus seemed to pulse on the page, almost mocking him, as if the name alone was a clue to the horrors they had unleashed. Just as he began to piece together what he was reading, a sound broke the silence. A faint, scraping noise echoing from somewhere deeper within the facility. It was slow, deliberate, like metal being dragged across concrete. His heart skipped a beat as he froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, a rhythmic scrape, pause, as if something was moving towards him. Panic surged through him, his pulse racing as he turned to leave. But the door behind him now felt miles away, the hallway stretching out endlessly. He took a step back, his gaze fixed on the dark corridor ahead, his breath coming in shallow gasps. And then, from the shadows, he thought he saw a figure, something shifting, moving just out of sight. Just as he was about to leave, that scraping sound stopped. Silence filled the air, so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. And then, a soft whisper, just behind him, so close he could feel the breath on his neck. "Turn around, if you dare." With a cold, paralyzing dread, he slowly turned, every instinct screaming at him to run, but something held him in place. The shadows seemed to pulse, to come alive, and in that moment he knew whatever was hidden here, whatever they had tried to bury, it was no longer sleeping. His mind screamed for him to turn back, to leave this place, to forget everything he had seen and just run. But he was frozen, his legs feeling as though they had sunk into the floor. The scraping sound was still echoing in his mind, and as he forced himself forward, the silence around him thickened, settling heavily in the air. He continued down the hallway, each step slower than the last, feeling as though he were descending into something he could never escape. The corridor opened up into a larger room, dimly lit by a single flickering fluorescent bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls here were different, cold metal instead of cement, lined with strange instruments and control panels covered in dust and cobwebs. The room was cluttered with broken glass vials scattered across the floor, some of them cracked open and leaking a strange, oily substance that seemed to give off a faint glow. The air was thick with a sickly sweet stench, the unmistakable odor of decay mixed with chemicals. It was a smell that clawed its way down his throat, making him gag, his stomach churning with every breath. There were metal tables lined up along the far wall, each one outfitted with thick, rusted shackles bolted to the sides. He couldn't tell if they were meant to hold something down or to keep it in. The tables were stained with something dark, a pattern of spattered marks that trailed down to the floor and left twisted trails in their wake. His eyes traced these stains as they led to the corner of the room, where something large and shadowy lurked. And then he saw a cage. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, made of reinforced metal bars that looked almost chewed, as if something had tried to tear its way out. The inside was cloaked in shadow, but as his eyes adjusted, he began to make out the shape of something inside, something crouched low to the ground, twisted, unnatural. He squinted, trying to make out more details. The figure was vaguely human but wrong. Its body was hunched over, limbs elongated, almost distorted, as though they had been stretched beyond their natural limits. Its skin looked pale, sickly, like it hadn't seen daylight in years. But the worst part, The part that made his blood turn to ice was its eyes, two faintly glowing orbs that pierced through the darkness, unblinking, fixed straight on him. His heart pounded so loudly that he could feel it in his throat, his pulse racing with each step he took toward the cage. His hands were slick with sweat, trembling as he lifted one to his mouth, fighting the urge to scream. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound, just sat there watching him, its head tilted slightly, almost curious. He wanted to look away, to turn and run, but he couldn't. His gaze was locked with those eyes, those terrifying, unblinking eyes that seemed to hold a glimmer of something almost human. He tried to tell himself it was just a trick of the light, but there was an intelligence there, a recognition that made his skin crawl. He took a shaky step backward, his hand brushing against one of the metal tables, sending a loud clanging echoing through the room. At the sound, the creature's head jerked, its body shifting in the shadows. He could see more of it now, the twisted angles of its limbs, the way its bones seemed to jut out from beneath its skin, too sharp, too wrong. The creature moved slightly, and he could hear the faint rustle of chains, a scraping sound as its claws dragged against the metal floor. A surge of terror shot through him, his mind racing with 1,000 questions he couldn't begin to answer. What was this thing? How had it come to be here? And why did it look at him with that strange, knowing gaze, as if it were waiting for something or someone? He felt the chill of fear prickling at his skin, his hands cold and numb, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But he couldn't tear his eyes away from it, couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him with something almost like hunger. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the creature turned its head, those unblinking eyes fixing on him with a focus that made his blood freeze. It cocked its head, studying him, and for a brief, horrifying moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something in its gaze, a spark of awareness, as if it understood exactly who he was and why he was here. His heart pounded harder, each beat echoing in his chest like a drum, and he took a trembling step back, desperate to break eye contact, to escape the magnetic pull of those eyes. But then, just as he was about to turn away, he saw a faint curl at the corner of its mouth, a hint of a smile that was almost human. He stumbled backward, his legs weak, his mind racing with fear and confusion. He wanted to run, to scream, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the creature's gaze held him, its eyes unblinking, watching him with a dark, twisted amusement, as if it knew a secret he would never understand. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, echoing from somewhere deep within the shadows, he heard it say, "Are you afraid?" The words were faint, distorted, but they chilled him to the bone. He opened his mouth to answer, but no sound came out, his voice strangled by fear. The creature tilted its head, its gaze never wavering, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of something almost alive in those eyes. Stumbling back from the cage, heart racing and breaths coming fast, he forced himself to look away from the creature's piercing gaze. His mind reeled, grasping for some rational explanation that might make sense of the horror he had just seen. But as he backed away, his eyes caught sight of a row of filing cabinets along the far wall, nearly hidden in the shadows. A sense of grim curiosity took hold, a need to understand what could have led to the creation of something so grotesque, so unnatural. He walked toward the cabinets, his footsteps muffled on the cold floor, his hand trembling as he pulled open the nearest drawer. Inside, stacks of folders were crammed tightly together, each one thick with papers, their covers stamped with large red confidential labels. His fingers brushed across them, feeling the texture of the worn, dusty paper beneath his touch. The labels bore strange project names: Project Lazarus, Variant Protocol, Hybrid Trials. The words meant nothing to him, but their ominous presence was unmistakable. He pulled one file out at random, flipping it open to reveal tightly written notes, pages upon pages of observations, lab results, and progress reports. As he scanned the pages, the words blurred together, scientific jargon he could barely understand. But certain phrases jumped out at him, sharp and jagged, lodging themselves into his mind: human subjects, genetic alteration, hybrid integration. He read further, his eyes widening in horror as the details began to unfold. They had been experimenting on people, turning humans into something else, something that barely resembled the beings they had once been. Each file detailed a subject, identified only by a number, each one a failed experiment, a grotesque failure that defied nature. He read about subjects who had exhibited bizarre, uncontrollable mutations, bodies that had twisted and contorted under the strain of forced genetic manipulation. Some had been described as growing extra limbs, others with skin that had turned to scales, bones that had shattered and reformed in unnatural ways. And then there was Subject 0, the only one without a failure note beside its number. His hands shook as he turned the page, each word feeling like a blow to his sanity. There were clinical descriptions of side effects, detached, emotionless, as if they were nothing more than statistics. Phrases like extreme aggression, loss of cognitive function, and most chilling of all, complete loss of humanity. They had been trying to merge human and animal DNA, testing limits that had never been meant to be crossed. Some subjects were noted as responsive, but others, the note simply said terminated due to risk of exposure. His stomach twisted as he stumbled upon a note scribbled in the margin, the handwriting erratic, almost panicked. They can't control it. It's only a matter of time. The ink was smeared, as if whoever had written it had been in a rush, a frantic scrawl that hinted at a growing dread among the scientists. And then, another note, added beneath it, containment measures are failing. Subject 0 is exhibiting signs of sentience. Sentience. The word echoed in his mind, a hollow reminder of the creature's eyes, those unblinking, too aware eyes that had looked into him, as if it knew exactly who he was. He flipped through more pages, finding records of other failed subjects, names and dates with deceased stamped over them. Some pages contained photos blurry, hastily taken images that showed figures strapped to tables, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies contorted into grotesque shapes. He forced himself to keep reading, driven by a sick compulsion to understand what had gone so terribly wrong here. Each page felt like a descent deeper into madness, a layer peeled back to reveal horrors he couldn't have imagined. But the worst part was the notes on Subject 0, the culmination of their twisted experiments. The documents grew sparse, fewer notes as if the researchers had been too terrified to observe it any longer. The last entries spoke of abilities, unnatural and terrifying rapid cellular regeneration, enhanced strength, heightened senses. The kind of things that belonged in horror stories, not real life. And then, scrawled in the same handwriting as before, a final, chilling note, it's learning. God help us, it's learning. The air grew thick with tension as he closed the file, his mind whirling. This place, this experiment, it wasn't about scientific advancement. It was about control. They had tried to create something they could use, something that could serve their needs without question, without thought. But in their arrogance, they had gone too far, and now they had unleashed something beyond their control, something that had taken on a life of its own. Just as he was about to move, a low hum filled the air, an undercurrent of machinery coming to life somewhere nearby. The sound was faint, almost lost in the silence, but it was there, a steady, rhythmic vibration that seemed to pulse through the walls. He froze, listening, his heartbeat matching the hum as it grew louder, more insistent. And then, from somewhere down the corridor, he heard it, the unmistakable creak of a door opening, the faint echo of footsteps coming closer. He glanced around, panic rising, his mind racing with the knowledge he had just uncovered. Whatever was here, whatever they had created, it was still out there. And now, he wasn't sure if he could find his way out before it found him. His thoughts were interrupted by a low mechanical whirring, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls. And with it, another sound, distant but growing louder. A slow, rhythmic thud, like heavy machinery at work, or something large moving down the hall. His heart stopped as he realized what it could mean. The footsteps grew louder, more defined, and he knew he had to move. But as he looked back at the files scattered across the table, he couldn't help but linger on a final line, printed at the bottom of the last page he had read. Subject 0 is to remain contained under all circumstances. Breach will result in immediate facility lockdown. And then, a chill washed over him as the meaning of those words sank in. Whatever lay deeper within this lab, whatever horror they had brought to life, was no longer contained. He stepped away from the table, the files slipping from his fingers as he moved toward the door. The low hum of machinery grew louder, filling his ears, each thud growing heavier, closer. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, feeling the weight of everything he had uncovered, the horrific realization that this was only the beginning. And as he stepped into the hallway, a single thought echoed through his mind, a promise of the terror yet to come. What I was about to see next would haunt me forever. As he crept into the dim corridor, every instinct screamed at him to run, but he forced himself forward, each step echoing in the silence. He was close to the main entrance now, or at least he hoped he was. But this part of the facility was different, older, with cracked tiles and faint stains on the walls, remnants of things he didn't dare imagine. He turned a corner, his pulse racing, and froze. Footsteps, steady, purposeful footsteps echoed down the hallway, drawing closer with every beat of his racing heart. He darted to the side, pressing himself against the wall, hidden in a dark alcove as the footsteps drew nearer. He held his breath, watching, every muscle tense, praying that whoever or whatever was approaching wouldn't see him. A man appeared, dressed in a lab coat, his face pale, his eyes hollow and unfocused, like someone going through the motions of a life that had long since drained away. The man walked down the hallway with a clipboard in hand, his steps precise, almost mechanical. He approached the room where the creature was held, unlocking the door with a series of beeps and clicks that reverberated through the silent hallway. The door creaked open, and he slipped inside. He crept closer, carefully leaning just enough to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. The sight sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through him. Inside, the creature lay chained to the floor, the thick, reinforced links binding it to heavy metal rings embedded deep in the concrete. Its limbs were twisted, stretched at unnatural angles, and its skin bore fresh cuts and bruises, remnants of struggles that must have been violent and desperate. Despite its horrifying appearance, there was something almost pitiable about it, something that tugged at his heart despite his fear. Whatever it was, it had been brought into this world by force, twisted and reshaped, made into something monstrous. The technician approached cautiously, his hands trembling as he reached for a console beside the cage. A panel on the wall glowed faintly, its screen filled with symbols and graphs, monitoring the creature's vitals, tracking data he couldn't begin to understand. The creature's breathing was slow, labored, its glowing eyes half closed, as if exhausted from a recent struggle. But then, without warning, those eyes snapped open, locking onto the technician with a predatory focus that sent shivers down his spine. The man froze, his hands trembling as he took a hesitant step back. He whispered something under his breath, a desperate plea, but it was too late. In a blur of movement, the creature lunged, its chains clanking, straining against the bolts in the floor as it threw its full weight against its restraints. The sound was deafening, metal scraping against metal, the screech filling the room as the creature fought to reach the terrified technician. Its mouth opened in a snarl, revealing rows of teeth, far too sharp, too numerous, catching the light as it lunged forward, stopped only by the final inches of its chains. The technician stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet, his face a mask of pure terror. His voice came out in a strangled gasp, too soft to hear, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly dropped his clipboard. He seemed to be murmuring something, words that might have been commands or pleas or perhaps prayers. His heart raced as he watched, realizing the sheer horror of what this place truly was. It wasn't just a lab, it was a prison, a place where these creatures, these twisted, tormented beings were locked away, hidden from the world. The people who worked here knew exactly what they were doing, knew the cost of their work, yet continued in cold, detached silence. These creatures were products of experiments gone wrong, mutations forced upon them, lives twisted into forms that defied reason. He could feel his own fear twist into something sharper, a mixture of horror and pity, as he realized that they too were victims imprisoned in bodies they couldn't control, bound to a fate they couldn't escape. As he watched, the technician seemed to regain his composure, quickly backing away and exiting the room, securing the door with trembling hands before nearly running down the hallway. But even after he was gone, the creature continued to strain against its chains, its eyes still glowing, still locked on the door as if it could sense the presence of others, waiting for any chance to escape. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to tear his gaze away, every instinct screaming at him to leave, to find his way out before he was discovered. He turned back toward the hallway, determined to make his escape, his mind racing with the horrors he had just witnessed. But as he reached the main corridor leading toward the entrance, he saw something that made his heart drop. The heavy metal doors were sealed shut, a flashing red light above them indicating that they were locked. He rushed to the keypad, punching in the access code he'd been given on his first day, his fingers trembling with desperation. The screen blinked back at him, cold and unyielding, displaying the words "access denied." Panic surged through him as he tried again, his hands shaking, each failed attempt deepening the dread settling in his chest. It was as if the entire facility had shifted into lockdown, trapping him inside with the horrors he had just uncovered. He glanced around, his mind racing, realizing that he was now a part of the nightmare he had only just begun to understand. With his escape route cut off and the red light above the entrance casting a sinister glow across the walls, he knew he was running out of options. His mind raced, trying to piece together an alternative way out. But everywhere he turned, the facility seemed to pull him deeper into its labyrinthine hallways. He tried to backtrack, hoping to find another route that might lead to an exit. But instead he found himself lost in a maze of dimly lit corridors, the walls closing in, every shadow now seeming to hide some unseen threat. His steps echoed as he moved further, the cold air thickening, suffocating him as he tried to steady his breathing. Then he stumbled upon a door with a small, grimy window. Inside, the faint glow of an old fluorescent light illuminated rows of cabinets, shelves overflowing with dusty boxes, and the walls covered in photographs. Compelled by a mix of morbid curiosity and dread, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room felt different from the others, as if time itself had forgotten it. Dust hung heavy in the air, catching the light, drifting slowly like ash, and he could feel an oppressive stillness that weighed on him. He approached the nearest wall, his eyes adjusting to the photographs that lined it in uneven rows. At first, they seemed like ordinary ID photos, each showing men and women in lab coats, their faces calm, almost hopeful, with slight smiles. But then he noticed the stamp across each one missing. He moved down the row, his eyes darting from one face to the next, each marked with that same damning word. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of faces, each of them staring out at him with an eerie stillness, frozen in time. He felt a chill crawl up his spine, the realization settling heavily in his gut. These people had worked here, and none of them had left. He remembered the technician he had seen just moments before, his hollow eyes, his lifeless expression. Was he just another cog in this nightmare, another body waiting to be added to the wall? He turned, spotting an old tape recorder resting on a cluttered table, buried beneath a pile of documents. The machine looked ancient, the kind you'd find in forgotten archives, its buttons worn and faded. Almost as if possessed, he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the cold metal as he pressed the play button. A crackle of static filled the air, followed by a distorted, weary voice, a man, his tone laced with exhaustion, fear, and something else, a faint trace of regret. "This is Dr. Harold Grayson," the voice began, a note of resignation heavy in each word. "If you're hearing this, then you've stumbled upon the truth behind Project Lazarus. I don't know who you are, or how you found this place, but by now, you've probably seen them, the things we created, the things we tried to control." The voice paused, as if the weight of his confession was too much to bear, and then it continued, slower, each word more chilling than the last. "We wanted to push the boundaries of human potential, to unlock abilities beyond comprehension. We told ourselves it was for the greater good, for science, for progress, but we were wrong. We were so wrong. Our subjects didn't respond as we'd hoped. They changed, evolved into something we couldn't predict, couldn't contain. We lost control. They became monsters." A chill settled over him as the doctor's voice trailed off, replaced by the faint hum of the recording device, as if the silence itself were swallowing the horrors the doctor couldn't bring himself to describe. He could hear faint, haunting sounds in the background, screams, the clatter of metal, and a sickening thud, followed by a long, strained silence. The doctor's voice returned, lower, filled with a new kind of fear. "If you're still listening, then you need to understand this wasn't an accident. The facility, it needs people like you. Fresh blood, new minds, those willing to do whatever it takes. You were chosen, brought here to continue the work, or to become part of it." The last words echoed in his mind, the horrifying realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't here by accident. The facility had lured him in, drawn him into its twisted maze of secrets and horrors, not as an innocent bystander, but as the next subject, the next pawn in their monstrous game. They had been watching him all along, waiting for him to reach this point, to uncover the truth, to seal his fate. A piercing, shrill alarm suddenly filled the air, making him jump, his heart pounding as red emergency lights began flashing, bathing the room in an eerie, pulsing glow. A voice crackled over the intercom, distorted and robotic, each word punctuated by static. Containment breach. All personnel evacuate. Containment breach. He could hear doors slamming, metal clanging as lockdown procedures activated throughout the facility, sealing off corridors, trapping whatever horrors were loose within these walls. And in that moment he realized he was trapped inside with them. The creatures he had seen, the twisted, unnatural beings brought to life through cruelty and arrogance, they were no longer restrained. They were free. Panic surged through him as he looked back at the wall of photographs, the faces of the missing staring back at him, their eyes hollow, filled with a silent plea. He understood now. They had all been chosen, drawn in just as he had, each one brought here to be part of this experiment, this prison of horrors. The intercom crackled to life again, the voice growing more frantic, distorted, as if struggling against interference. Evacuate immediately. All personnel evacuate. Failure to comply will result in termination. He ran toward the door, his footsteps pounding against the cold, tiled floor, but as he reached the hallway, he heard it, a slow, deliberate scraping, the sound of something heavy being dragged, coming from the depths of the corridor. The creature he had seen, the one chained and restrained, was now free, its unblinking eyes burning in his mind as he heard it draw closer, its movements slow, methodical, as if savoring the thrill of the hunt. He backed away, his mind racing as he tried to remember the path back, but everything looked different now, warped and twisted by the flashing red lights. Shadows danced along the walls, and every door he passed was locked, trapping him in a nightmare with no way out. As he turned down another hallway, he came face to face with a security monitor on the wall. It flickered to life, displaying a live feed of the corridors, and he saw them, the creatures, the subjects, wandering through the hallways, searching, drawn toward the sound of his footsteps. Their bodies were twisted, deformed, products of failed experiments, their movements jerky, unnatural, as they prowled the facility in search of anything, or anyone. He took a shaky breath, feeling the walls close in around him, his mind spiraling as he struggled to stay calm. He had to find a way out, had to escape before they found him. But as the intercom crackled one final time, the voice spoke again, its tone calm, almost mocking, as if delivering a final, twisted warning. "Thank you for your contribution, Subject 1. The flashing red lights and the blaring alarms seemed to merge into a single wave of noise and panic as he bolted down the corridor, his pulse pounding in his ears. Every shadow seemed alive, every darkened corner a hiding place for the horrors that lurked within the facility. He darted from door to door, finding each one locked, sealed tight against any hope of escape. Behind him, the mechanical voice over the intercom repeated its command, but now it sounded warped, almost mocking, as if it knew he had nowhere to go. He turned a corner and froze. Just a few feet ahead, silhouetted against the flickering red lights, was the creature from the lab. Freed from its chains, it stood motionless, as though waiting for him, its elongated limbs twisted into unnatural angles. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over its misshapen frame, and in the half-light he could see the outlines of its exposed muscles and bone. It tilted its head, and those unblinking, glowing eyes locked onto him, cold and empty, like pits that swallowed any trace of humanity. He could feel its gaze piercing into him, a hollow stare that seemed to strip away every ounce of courage he had left. He took a step back, his breath coming in shallow gasps, as the creature let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that reverberated through the walls, shaking him to his core. And then, in one terrifyingly fluid motion, it moved, its limbs shifting with an unnatural grace, lurching forward with a speed that belied its twisted form. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls, each pounding beat of his heart driving him forward, faster and faster. He could hear it behind him, the scraping of claws against the floor, the ragged, uneven breaths that grew louder with each passing second. His vision blurred as he rounded corner after corner, his mind racing as he desperately searched for any path, any door that might lead to freedom. Then, up ahead, he saw a faint sliver of light spilling into the corridor from an open doorway, leading to a stairwell. A surge of hope filled him as he sprinted toward it, his lungs burning, legs aching. He glanced over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of the creature just a few paces behind, its eyes locked on him with a relentless hunger. He stumbled into the stairwell, slamming the door shut behind him, the metallic clang echoing through the confined space. He took the steps 2 at a time, his legs shaking, forcing himself upward as fast as his body would allow. The creature's snarls grew fainter, and for a moment, he dared to hope he'd lost it, that he might actually make it out alive. At the top of the stairwell, he burst through a door and into a corridor bathed in natural light, filtering through a distant window. His heart soared as he ran toward it, the taste of freedom on the tip of his tongue. He stumbled through the hallway, barely able to contain his relief as he saw an emergency exit door up ahead. The metal bar gleamed in the light, and beyond it, he could see a sliver of the outside world, the pale gray sky, the smell of fresh air, the faint rustling of wind through trees. He was so close, just a few more steps. His hand reached out, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the door's handle, feeling the promise of safety, of escape. He pushed, and the door swung open, flooding him with the smell of fresh air and the soft glow of daylight. He stepped outside, letting out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, his body relaxing for the first time since he had set foot in that hellish place. But as he took a step forward, he froze. His relief dissolved into a creeping sense of dread as he looked out over the landscape stretching before him. In the distance, barely visible through the haze, he saw another building, identical to the one he had just escaped, its walls scarred and weathered. Smoke rose from vents along its roof, curling into the sky like ghostly fingers reaching out, and faint screams echoed across the desolate expanse, carried on the wind. His heart sank as he took in the sight. There wasn't just one facility, there were many. Row upon row of identical structures stretched into the distance, each one a silent prison for the horrors they had created, each one hiding unspeakable secrets behind its cold gray walls. And then he heard a faint, haunting sound drifting on the breeze. It was the sound of voices, cries for help, desperate and fading, as though they were coming from far below the earth. The screams grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of pain and fear, and he realized with chilling clarity that these were the voices of others who had been drawn into this nightmare just as he had, others who had never made it out. He staggered backward, his mind reeling, unable to process the scale of what he was seeing. This wasn't just an experiment. It was a system, a network, a factory of horrors churning endlessly, devouring anyone unlucky enough to stumble across it. And he had barely escaped with his life. As he turned to run, the door behind him slammed shut with a metallic thud, and he heard the unmistakable sound of a lock clicking into place. He spun around, his heart pounding, his eyes darting between the building he had escaped and the endless stretch of identical structures beyond. He was out, but he wasn't truly free. He stood there, rooted to the spot, gazing out over the endless stretch of identical buildings. The realization settled over him, suffocating, as if a cold hand had wrapped around his heart and squeezed. The truth was undeniable, chilling in its simplicity and horror. He hadn't escaped, he had only been released, a cog in a machine that had planned this all along. Everything he had seen, the unlocked doors, the scattered documents, the cage left slightly open, it hadn't been a series of unfortunate accidents. It was deliberate, orchestrated. A shiver ran down his spine as he remembered the doctor's recording. That last haunting line, you were chosen. Brought here to continue the work, or to become part of it. He understood now that he had never been just a visitor in that facility. From the moment he set foot inside, he had been part of their twisted experiment, part of a cycle designed to feed the horrors hidden within those walls. They had let him escape, allowed him to glimpse the nightmare, to taste freedom, only to tighten the chains when he thought he was free. The facility was just one head of the Hydra, one piece of a monstrous puzzle stretching beyond anything he could comprehend. His escape had only served one purpose: to lure him into a false sense of security, to draw him into the heart of something far larger, far more terrifying than he could have imagined. A cold sweat covered his skin as he began to back away from the door, his eyes darting between the rows of distant buildings, each one identical, each one a prison for horrors he would never fully understand. He felt a presence, a lingering awareness pressing down on him, watching, waiting, as if the very air around him was charged with an unseen gaze, something that was observing his every move. He ran, stumbling, his mind racing, trying to shake off the sense of being watched, of being pursued. But no matter how fast he moved, No matter how far he went, that feeling of surveillance never left him. It clung to him like a shadow, a constant reminder that he had been marked, chosen, pulled into a nightmare he would never truly leave behind. Days passed after his escape, but sleep offered no comfort. Each night, as soon as he closed his eyes, the dreams would come, haunting him with images that were both vivid and fragmented. He would find himself back in the cold, dim corridors, hearing the faint scraping of chains, the hollow, unblinking eyes of the creature piercing through the darkness. He'd see the faces of those who had come before him, the missing, each one staring, silent, pleading, as if calling him to join them. Even awake, he couldn't shake the sensation of eyes watching him, tracking his every move. Shadows seemed to shift at the edge of his vision, as if something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. He'd feel a chill down his spine, a whisper of breath on the back of his neck, and he would turn, certain he'd find something standing there, but there was never anything, only empty air. And yet, deep down, he knew he was never truly alone. The facility, the experiment, the endless corridors filled with secrets they had become part of him, etched into his mind, impossible to escape. No matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he tried to forget, he could feel the pull of those walls, beckoning him back into the darkness. As he stared into the distance, his voice barely a whisper, he finally understood. I thought I escaped, but now I realize this was only the beginning. And as those words left his lips, he could almost hear the faintest of laughs, distant and hollow, echoing from the shadows. As the memories of that place consume me, I can't help but wonder, how many others are there like me? People drawn into the shadows, lured by a glimpse of something they were never meant to see. How many other facilities are out there, hidden in plain sight, each one holding horrors beyond comprehension? Sometimes, when I'm alone, I find myself reaching for the phone, wondering if I should tell someone, anyone, about what I saw. But the words never come. Who would believe me? One day I may return to find it, but maybe some secrets are best left hidden, some doors best left closed. If you've felt that chill, if you've seen those shadows at the edge of your vision, then you know what I mean. You know that certain truths can't be unseen. So if you were there, standing at the door to this nightmare, would you step inside? Would you face the darkness waiting on the other side? Share this if you wouldn't dare go in, and leave a comment below. Tell me, what would you do if you found this lab? Would you walk away, or would you try to uncover the secrets lurking just beneath the surface of our world? Because the truth is, once you know, there's no going back.
Did you survive this nightmare? If you enjoyed unraveling the dark secrets of the hidden lab, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss another spine-chilling story. Join our community of thrill seekers and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if you found a place like this? Stay curious and stay safe. Until next time, beware what lurks in the shadows.